Good morning, BookTube. Bill Ruttenberg here with the Ruttenberg Library, and coming here this morning and got a late start at school. We got pretty cold wind chill outside. It was snowing some. We got temperatures down to 25 below-ish, somewhere in there. And so anyway, we got a late start, and so I wanted to go ahead and get a book review done that I've been meaning to get done for quite some time. I don't know why I've been delayed on it, just haven't got it done. So anyway, I wanted to get that done this morning before I head off to school. And the book I'm going to review this morning is Washington's Secret War, The Hidden History of Valley Forge by Thomas Fleming. Now, this is a good book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. It's got 384 pages. It's got some illustrations in it. So there's one there. It's got some illustrations on in the middle. Pretty famous illustrations. Actually, funny story. The other day I was doing a video and I was showing off pictures in another book, and if you see that picture right there of John Lawrence, I was doing a book that had pictures of Benedict Arnold, and I can't remember who the second person was, and then the third person was John Andre, and I kid you not, he looked exactly like John Lawrence's picture here. And in that video I said John Lawrence, and then I felt, well, I didn't feel very smart, because I was like, why in the world would there be a picture of John Lawrence when they're talking about the Benedict Arnold issue? Anyway, the middle of this book's got lots of good pictures. That story really had nothing to do with anything, but I just thought it was funny. Maybe I was reading this book at the same time I was showing off the other book, and I must have had John Lawrence on the brain here, but I guess I wanted to explain myself a little bit. Anyway, getting on with this book. This is a 2005 book by Thomas Fleming. It's from Smithsonian Books, printed in New York City. It was one of the books he did later in life. Thomas Fleming was born in 1927 and actually passed away in 2017, so not that long ago. So like I said, this is one of his last books that he did. He's pretty famous for a lot of his work that he did. So he graduated from Fordham University in 1950 to become a historian and writer. And as I said, he wrote a lot of books, wrote 40 works of, over 40 works of fiction and nonfiction, and most of them dealing with the Revolution or the Civil War. There were some other ones that were, odds and end things, but those were his two main categories, especially the American Revolution. It was kind of the centerpiece of all of his writing. He's best known for his work on the American Revolution. He was the writer of the series Liberty, The American Revolution, which was also made into a PBS documentary where he helped host it. And so basically I wanted to tell you a little bit about the book, and I'll tell you what I like and what I don't like, and I'll give you my final rating out of 5 stars. And so I bought this book because I wanted to learn a little bit more about Valley Forge. Now, my original intent when I bought this book was not, well, once I read this, I realized it was not what I actually wanted. But I don't want to say that in a negative way. This turned out to be a very, very good book and very helpful to me. But I originally bought it with the intent of learning a little bit more from like the soldier's point of view about Valley Forge, and I wanted to learn some more about just life in Valley Forge. And he did that a little bit in here, so I don't want to say he didn't, but it turned out to be something totally different. Okay, this is more of a I would say more of a political novel. He talks a lot more about the political intricacies of Valley Forge. Now, some of you might say, well, duh. you could have read up on that and figured that out. And I fully admit that that was totally my fault. I could have done a little, just a little bit of review would have told me, what I needed to know about this book before I bought it. But I bought it on a whim and without any research of the book. And again, my fault, but it turned out to be a good mistake. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And it told me some other stuff. I learned some new stuff about Valley Forge. Some of it I already knew, but it went into a lot of detail. And then some of it, was just totally brand new stuff. So in the book, Thomas Fleming takes the reader back to Valley Forge, December of not 1977. That would be totally different history. December of 1777 through June of 1778. He walks the reader through those 6 months of time at the encampment at Valley Forge. And a lot of stuff happened in those 6 months. A lot of stuff that Fleming is going to argue totally saved the Revolution. It turned things around. And without Valley Forge, he kind of hints at the Revolution would have never been, ended successfully. It would have never been a success. And so throughout the book, he gives the reader a general description of life at the Valley Forge camp. He brings to life the winter of 77-78. He talks about all the setbacks, namely the lack of supplies and money and how that led to his army nearly starving to death. He does a good job of talking about the food supply or lack thereof, really. He talks about this army that was at Valley Forge being a blended army. It was very diverse. It was like the perfect example of America, really. You had all kinds of different nationalities there. Most of them that were in America at the time were represented in the camp. And so this becomes a melting pot of its own. And he says this is just symbolic of what America was, or what it was to become, really. Gives a very good description. What I really liked was he gave a very good description of what life was like for the British in Philadelphia, in their encampment. And I didn't know a whole lot about that. I knew they were there, but in a lot of other stories, they just say they're there. There's lots of them, and then they kind of leave it at that. They partied a little bit, and then they don't give a lot of detail. And Fleming goes into a little bit more detail to help paint that picture. And really what it does is it shows the drastic differences between the British Army and the American Army, and really what they face, those problems that they face. And it's a good comparison. So Fleming also does or shows how extreme the jealousies were in the founding era. That Washington was constantly dealing with jealous politicians, and it nearly ruined the Revolution. These jealousies did, and Washington really shows off his character. According to Fleming, he just stands above it all. But saying that doesn't mean he's not a good politician. George Washington, as you learn in this book, is a master politician, and he gives several examples of how that really wins the Revolution for him, or helps to win the Revolution. The Continental Congress was always super scared of George Washington taking power from them and basically becoming a king. It was their worst nightmare. It's what had happened throughout history in Europe and all over the world. You get a saving person who's going to save the country, and he ends up becoming the tyrant. And remember, they just got away from a tyrant, George III, and they did not want to go back to that. And so Congress is constantly sticking their noses in the military business because they think they can run things. And as you find out, they do a terrible job of decision making with the army. Fleming does a good job of showing that when things weren't good, when Washington's army is starving, in need of supplies, and just can't get anything in, clothes, nothing. Congress is going to try to make him the scapegoat. They're going to try to blame him for all of their inadequacies. And Washington's having to deal with that, along with, of course, the starvation and the freezing cold and everything else. Washington, he does a good job of showing how Washington was a good politician. He could do something that our current politicians can't. He knew when to open his mouth, but he also knew when to shut his mouth and just let things play out. I think there's a lot of politicians who could learn some stuff from George Washington, and I'll just leave it at that. And I told you in an earlier video I'm not going to get political, and I'm still not going to get political because I'm pointing the finger at both sides of the aisle. All right. Anyway, Washington, the long and short of it, Washington knew the gift of silence, what I call the gift of silence. He knew when to keep his mouth shut. Sometimes you don't have to say anything. So he's a master politician. And again, when I say that, I do mean it in a good way. He knows how to handle himself, how to show off the good side of his character. So the book also shows how Washington was able to keep his authority, keep his authority over other generals and politicians, but at the same time, he remained subordinate to the Continental Congress. He never tried to take power from them. I mean, there was a little bit of a power struggle, don't get me wrong, because he needed his army fed, and Congress just wasn't doing it. So he did try to take charge, but that does not mean that he tried to, do a total takeover. He knew that power was rested with the people. And in the end result, everybody knows he gave up power at the end of the Revolution, and that probably is one of the, at the end of the Revolution when he gives up power, it's probably one of the most key events in American history was him giving up power, not taking it, but giving it up, and that all but plays out right here at Valley Forge, where he definitely could have just taken over as a dictator. Chose not to, though. Fleming does a wonderful job of showing the political rivalry between Washington and, all his rivals. He wanted everyone wanted his job and thought they could do it, thought they could do it better, but they couldn't. And they definitely showed that at certain, different times during the Revolution. But in the book, he does the individual backstories and where do some of these rivalries come from. And so he talks about Horatio Gates, Charles Lee, Thomas Conway, Benjamin Rush, Sam Adams, John Adams, and a few others. But he does a good job of talking about those rivalries. He goes full on into the Conway cable and how they tried to take power away and give it to Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, which we all know he was not. He would have been nothing without Benedict Arnold. But anyway, that's a whole other story. He talks about things like Charles Lee and how he wanted a European-style army. And Washington, he understood that was not going to work in the American army. The mindset was different than what it was over in Europe. And so he gives a great example of that. Washington put good people around him. He was a good judge of character for the most part. He shows when the supply issues were going on and he was trying to find a replacement, he showed probably the best judgment when he put Nathaniel Greene there. Nathaniel Greene didn't want to be there. He wanted to, be fighting, but he listened to Washington because Washington knew that Greene was the guy he needed. He was a take charge kind of guy who was just going to get after and make sure things got done. And he totally changes how the supplies are coming into the Continental Army and at Valley Forge, and the men get fed. I mean, plain and simple. The men get fed, they get clothed, and that plays huge. He also used Friedrich von Steuben to train the army, and Steuben, of course, has got a funny story because he doesn't really speak English, and there's always the funny exchanges back and forth between him and the men, and Fleming does a good job of showing how there were multiple things that came out of using Steuben to train the army. Not only does he get the army trained, that's one, but it also gives the men a purpose of why they're being there. It gives them, just the reason why they're fighting, and unifies the army. It shows them that unity and draws them together, what they hadn't had before. So they begin to work as a unit, and he uses this as part of his argument of why Valley Forge is one of the most important events in the American Revolution. It's the turning point, because without that, the army falls apart. It does not unify, it falls apart, according to Fleming. So what I really liked about this book, I thought it did a great job in the description of the British soldiers in Philadelphia, like I said earlier. He does a phenomenal job of showing how Valley Forge is the key event in the American Revolution, and he gives a lot of proof to back up that opinion. He shows that it's the turning point in the Revolution. He says it saves the army, and therefore, in turn, saves the Revolution. He does a masterful job of giving that argument. I thought he did a good job of debunking several different myths. He talks about, I said the freezing cold of Valley Forge. Well, the freezing cold really was only maybe a couple days worth. Most of it was hovering, right at the 30-degree mark, and maybe a little bit. It was a little bit warmer than that. It was cold, but it was not probably the cold that they faced at Morristown. Morristown was much colder, and he kind of debunks that. And there's a couple other things that he goes into and does some heavy detail. Did Washington pray at Valley Forge? And that'll have a surprising answer for you. I'll let you get the answer to that when you read it. He shows how important the commissary department was to the survival of the army. Supplies are everything. If you don't have the supplies, you can't fight. I was talking with my kids. It's kind of surprising because when you talk about the Revolution, at least when I'm teaching it, sometimes I hate to admit it, but I fail to really, we talk about who has and who has not, and then we leave it at that. We don't talk about that continual need every day, day in and day out, for food. And that's something I probably need to talk about a little bit more in my class, and really drive that point home, because it's one of the most important things in the military is being able to supply your troops. If they can't eat, they can't fight. Plain and simple. And so he does a good job of hitting on that. He does a masterful job of telling the political stories of Washington and his rivals, and how they Washington proved to be very good at political maneuvering. He knew how to survive as the commanding general of the Continental Army. And it wasn't an accident. It was a purposeful, everything was done with a rhyme and a reason. It was purposeful. And he shows why he is what I call the man. Fleming uses, one of the things I really liked about his book is he uses short chapters. They're divided up into like little mini sections, 1 to 3 pages. And it's like the story within the story. And he tells a lot of different points of view so each chapter it's broken up on the time, it's in chronological order, and each chapter deals with one big issue. But within the chapter itself, those little mini sections are all just different perspectives, all looking at that one issue that the chapter happens to be talking about. And I really like that. I know when I teach my kids, they have basically a short attention span, so I have to kind of, you have to talk about the exciting stuff, and it's bam, 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 with different stories, and that's what he does in this book. So that's one of the reasons I really liked it. It makes it entertaining. It makes it faster paced. So what I didn't like about the book, again, this is probably more just my own fault, but I thought he could have given more of the story of the soldiers and their plight in Valley Forge. I know he did not do that on purpose, because I think that story's been told quite often, and what he wanted to tell about Valley Forge was all the other stuff that doesn't always get told. But unfortunately, that's what I was looking for. again, a little research, looking up some stuff about the book probably would have, I would have figured that out. But I'm glad I bought it. I don't want you to think I'm not glad I bought it. I'm glad I bought it, glad I read it. I thought it was really good. The book is intended for an adult audience. I'd probably give it to my high school age kids, but not my middle school. Probably a few too many politics for the middle school kids. But I'd recommend it to any adult. It's very entertaining. And my final rating for this book, I'd probably give it 4 out of 5 stars. And so thank you for sitting here and listening to me ramble on about Washington's Secret War. I thought it was a great book. If this video helps you in any way, please make sure that you hit the like button down below and subscribe to my channel, and then share it with others. Till next time, happy reading.